Thank you guys for coming. My name is Whitney Kotluski. I'm a senior user experience designer at Esri. Just kind of give you guys a backstory. Currently, I have just finished up the redesign of ArcGIS Navigator. If you guys got a chance when you're going through the showcase area, it's part of the field operation apps. And so there's a new redesign happening, and probably by UC, you guys might be able to get a chance to play around with that. Prior to that, I actually worked on insights for ArcGIS from the ground up. So that was kind of my baby. And then prior to that, I was actually working on ArcGIS Pro. So I kind of actually have quite a bit of experience with Esri apps and accessibility. When Esri really started trying to make moves, I think John had a chance to kind of help shepherd us into this direction. But they actually sent us out to a conference and was like, hey, we need to be more compliant. We're getting in trouble. Go. And me and another UX designer at the time were like, okay, we go to Texas. We end up at this accessibility conference, and it really did just change the trajectory of our knowledge base and what we were able to bring back to the company. So today, we're really just going to cover some basics to accessibility. It's going to be a little bit of what we're doing at Esri, plus anything that you guys could do on your own. So if you have any questions, please hold them. We'll try to take account to that at the end. And hopefully, if you guys have anything specific, like if you want to show something, maybe we can stick around and we can talk through some things. So hopefully we can get there. But can I get a show of hands of people who are familiar with the topic at hand? Like, have you done any accessibility checks, read something about accessibility guidelines? Okay. How many people are familiar with WCAG 2.0? All right, we got some folks. How many people are familiar with Section 508? All right, and then can I get a show of hands of people that are interested in desktop and web accessibility? Okay, so quite a bit of you. And then anybody interested in mobile accessibility? All right, cool, awesome. So this should be fun. So what is accessibility? The biggest thing is really just trying to make our products, our interfaces accessible to everyone. About 15% of the world population lives with some form of a disability, so that's roughly about 1 billion people. In the US, it's 1 in 5 adults have a disability. And really, the things that we're thinking about when we're thinking about disability is either long-term, temporary, or short-term. Long-term would be someone, maybe they were born with it, and they're never going to be able to recover from this type of impairment. Temporary, it could be, I had surgery, I had an ear infection, something like that, where now I am immobile in that particular area. And then situational would be, I just had a baby recently, so holding a baby and trying to do work at the laptop, holding my phone while driving, which is not also something that people recommend, but it happens. So these are things that you think about that are situational. As a designer specifically, that situational one really is an area that we like to focus on at Esri, especially for like the mobile apps, because of the fact that people are doing things out in the field, they're multitasking, they're not just sitting at their desk on their phone, they're out in the world doing things. So there's all these factors that come into play. So it definitely is something that we have to consider and think about to make their lives a lot easier when using our applications. So why is it important? People with disabilities deserve equal rights. I think we all can agree on that people deserve equal rights. And also the ADA and Section 508 have rules and regulations. You guys raised your hands earlier, so I know you guys are familiar with those. As well as just having really good design practice. As a user experience designer, thinking about accessibility and having that forward thinking really does help out at the end, especially when we're doing QA, especially when I'm trying to communicate with developers. It really does save you a lot of time and effort when you're thinking about it up front. And so at Esri, the bigger things that we're doing a lot of knowledge sharing. I have John in the back that he's also kind of an advocate for accessibility at Esri, and he's really been heading on trying to help us communicate. I have Tao here as well. He's the senior UX architect working on ArcGIS Online, and he has been doing like phenomenal work with the ArcGIS Online team. But really it's around knowledge sharing. We have a couple of different, we have crews at Esri that meet, and we talk about accessibility, where we're at, try to answer questions that are coming in from GeoNet and from our outside community, as well as internal reviews. So this is where we're pretty much creating our own checklist to say, hey, this is where we add up, this is how we're going to be able to comply, and then this is also how we're going to communicate where we don't. Because that's really the biggest thing about this kind of effort is aiming to be compliant. We realize that we're never going to be at the top of accessibility for interacting with maps, for instance. There's a lot of things that come into play, but what we can do is try to aim to be compliant. So we're working it into new features. We have Calcite Web, which is a framework that we already have built-in components that basically consider the accessibility side of things, whether it be color contrast or actually being able to tab and navigate to the component. So there's a lot of work happening. We still have a long way to go, but I think from at least 3 years ago even, I can say that we've done a lot of work in this area. And so today we'll cover the background, typically just around just kind of what accessibility is, what the things we should be thinking about. We'll jump into some automated tests that you guys can take back with you. And I'll show you guys some tools that we use for that. We'll look at keyboard testing. So that's all around just navigating with your keyboard through your interfaces, just to see where you add up. And that's really going to be around like the focus order, the tab structures. There's also ARIA labeling and things like that. Basically just the structure of your web page or your mobile application or your desktop application. And then we'll do I'll show you guys a little bit about the screen reader testing. And I have like a little demo that I can kind of quickly go through for that. And then we'll end on the color accessibility, which is a test that's, I think, if you've never done accessibility checks or you've never really tapped into like doing accessibility testing, I say color contrast checking is about the easiest thing that you can do. My 15-month-old baby probably could knock it out of the park. So I think you guys will be good to go. Even if out of anything I talk about today, you should be able to make sure that your apps are compliant with color and text being readable. Okay, by the end of this, you guys will at least be able to do that. So why accessibility testing? So I talked about having a good user experience, really saving you a lot of time and money up front. And really it comes down to, if you are a developer in the room, if you've developed anything before and you've put it out, you have to check it, you have to test it. That's the only way that you actually know what people are really truly going to experience. So that Q&A, that QA process is really what this is about. And the functional test, so I saw a show of hands of people who were familiar with WCAG 2.0. For those who raised their hands, that didn't raise their hands for that, but raised their hands for Section 508, there is a lot of overlap. So what we try to promote is WCAG 2.0 as being the kind of like source of truth. And then from there's a lot of other regulations like Section 508 or even for mobile accessibility that fit underneath that tier. So there was a lot of work that happened for WCAG 2.0, and that has become like the source of truth. So definitely for web accessibility, but if you go to w3c.com, I think it is, they also provide, using the same guidelines, they will provide you with mobile accessibility counterparts to this as well as desktop. So it all ends up kind of being under the same bubble. And the regulations, they're less objective. I think they actually really give good examples. It's a lot of reading if you haven't checked it out, but it's very thorough. And then anyone can do the test. So they make it so that if you get a chance to take a look at what you need to be looking for in your application, you pretty much can just do it yourself. And so I'm going to go over a quick overview of this, and I'm going to jump out just so that way you guys can see my notes as well. So the four main parts, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and I want to make sure I get these down clear. But perceivable being that it can be invisible to all their senses, operable being that the interface cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform, and then understandable that user must be able to understand the information as well as the operation. And then robust, making sure that users can actually access those technologies like the assistive technology interacting with the application. Let me jump back out. And so the success criteria for that, we've listed it out. So if you guys go on WCAG 2.0, they have actually the same categories for the success criteria. And the level A, AA, and AAA, it's actually the more A's you get, the more non-UI like your website is, right? So what we try to say is if you stay in the level AA area, you're actually kind of in a good place where you have a nice looking website or nice looking app, and it also is accessible. If you're on the single A, you probably have hopefully a nice looking app as well, but it might not be as accessible. And the AAA is you probably just have a bunch of hyperlinks and just text, and it probably doesn't look that great. But if you have a great looking site as well, kudos to you. But text alternatives is really around, and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go through an example of keyboard navigation and screen readers. But text alternatives, an example of that would be if I have an image on a page and I navigate to that, can the screen reader pick up what that is? You know, the non-text content. Time-based media, making sure that I have alternatives. For instance, if I have a video, do I have audio? If I have a video and audio, do I have text captions? Am I providing other alternatives for users to be able to access the content? Another one for keyboard accessibility and enough time, just making sure that people can access and operate within the context that they're in my interface. The seizures one's interesting because, believe it or not, if stuff is flashing and it's too much, it can actually cause certain individuals to have seizures. I used to have seizures when I was younger, so I can tell you now, I still can't see like certain 3D movies, so I can tell you it is actually a serious thing. Understandable as far as things being readable, predictable. Predictable is an interesting one too, because you're kind of thinking like a UX designer, I believe in this sense, because it's kind of like, is this expected? Is this interaction expected? If I'm navigating through the header of your website and I'm using the keyboard, am I going in the expected place, or is it dropping me down at the bottom of the page, which we've seen that a lot, where you're navigating and where am I? I'm not where I thought I was going to be, and now I'm like trying to search for this. Even in my check, I'm trying to search for like, where's the focus order at, you know? Because it's all the index is all off, you know. So that's another good one to think about. And then compatible is the same that I talked about earlier around just making sure that assistive technologies can actually pick up my components in my website. On the mobile side, for those that were interested, I went ahead and just kind of grabbed what we saw for WCAG 2.0 for web, and that also could be applied to desktop. And I went ahead and just kind of made this quick cheat sheet for you for the mobile side. So I went ahead and highlighted the things that you're going to see that point out with the small screen size, of course. Zoom and magnification is huge because now you need like dynamic text because the text is much smaller on the smaller screen. Keyboard for touch. So not only is it the keyboard that's baked into the native platform, but then also you want to think about those touch targets and the spacing because once again, people are working in a smaller real estate. Gestures are another thing to think about, and are they appropriate? And then the orientation and layout of your content is another huge thing. You know, whether you're in the wider screen or if you're in portrait mode, you know, how does that affect the user experience at this point? And then just making sure that, you know, when it comes to robust, aside from being compatible with assistive technology, can it also be used with a virtual keyboard? Like if you're using a Surface Pro or you're using like an iPad and you happen to have a keyboard, a Bluetooth keyboard with you. So you guys can just kind of, if you end up wanting to do these, I'll make sure we share the slides so you guys can take a look at this and use this as a basis. We typically use this kind of like overview as our checklist. So if you're ever interested in trying to like, okay, so how would I go and take this to my development team and say like, here's where we stand? What we typically try to do then is just mark off, did we comply in this particular area? So now that the goal is that we want to reach level AA for zoom and magnification under this perceivable section, did we actually meet that or not? And then here's some notes for the devs to be able to fix that issue. So the test process. We start with automated testing, then we move into the keyboard testing, which is just strictly using the keyboard only. Then we jump into the screen reader testing, and then at any point you can do the color test, which we'll go over in this presentation. But typically this is kind of the 4 things that we do here at Esri. All right, let's jump into automated testing. So no automated test can actually prove that you're totally conforming with any given WCAG success criterion. I think it's like 20 to 30% of automated tests actually will find issues in your interface. So that other 60 to 70% you kind of have to do manually, which is their keyboard navigation, using the screen reader, and doing the color contrast test. So this automated test, what I like about it though, is it kind of gives you a basis of kind of like how far off you are. So it's kind of like you're throwing something out there and like, oh, is it going to come back okay? I actually just recently was testing Navigator because we're still in development, even though my designs are finished. And I was just like, you know what? It's at that point where you have to check accessibility. I wonder how far, we're at, how far off we are. Luckily, to my surprise, we're not too bad off because we are using native components. But it is a good start, I think, especially if you haven't gone through the breadth of the WCAG 2.0 guidelines. This is a really good start to just be able to kind of get your hands dirty and see where your app is at. So we use AXE, or AXE, if you want to call it that, which is kind of basically like a browser-based plugin that you can apply to either Chrome or Firefox. And it aims at no false positives, which is really, really good. And we found that this has favorable results. So we were using, if anyone has heard of Wave, we were using that plugin when we first started. And we noticed that it wasn't actually giving us as favorable results, and we weren't really sure what to do with the results. So one thing that's nice about this particular kind of extension is that they provide suggestions, and you are able to kind of come up with a solution that you can kind of bring back to the dev team. And then also they do have some helpful documentation. So we can kind of take a look at how you would even launch that up and get that started. So let's see if I can go into this mode so I can actually see it. So I've already installed the plugin, and I'm using Chrome for this. And what you're going to want to do is jump to, once you've installed the AXE plugin, you're just going to go ahead and go into the tabs and select Analyze. Oh, I'm getting an error. Let's refresh. I think it's because of the size.
Yeah, turn off the responsive mode.
Yeah, there we go. I was wondering if that was going to cause me problems. No, wait, hold on. Sorry, guys. This is why we like to do demos up front. Okay, toggle. No, I can still use this. That's just what the problem is. Okay. Can I just turn this off?
Yeah, click the button. To the left.
This one?
No, the next to the element where you have the blue highlight.
Yeah, this guy?
Yeah, to the right.
Yeah, I did that, but it takes me into this weird state. Why is it making it? That's weird. Okay.
Actually shouldn't matter.
Yeah, let's see if it does it again though. But you're supposed to be able to select this.
Are you on the Wi-Fi?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll work now.
Yeah. Turn off your Wi-Fi and turn on again.
Esri 2019. I should have went in landline. There we go. Is it down still, or is it up Esri 2019?
Yeah, it should be Esri 2019.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see if maybe we'll get some action now with it. Well, sorry to short that demo, But basically, this plugin will be able to generate results for you guys that will be able to kind of highlight things that you actually need to work on. So it could be anything from the color contrast to maybe the structure or for instance, the non-labeling of elements, like we talked about text alternatives earlier in the other slide. So maybe, for instance, these icons that I have on the screen might not be labeled correctly in the code. And so it will also pick that up as well. There could be some like ordering structures that it might highlight to fix. The color contrast will also be noted through that plugin. I know I talked about how favorable it was, but I'm going to say due to internet issues, I'm going to call that one. Maybe we can come back towards the end and things will be working out so I can show you guys it. But it actually is a very useful one. You can also use Wave. And then if you type in like accessibility automated check for web applications, there's a long list that come up. I think there's like A11Y, there's another one, I forget the name now, but there's a long list of them that you can use. It's just this one is the one that we do like to promote and highlight. And then on the mobile side, so those who were interested, so within like Android Studio, Xcode, you can kind of get in within the actual application itself, the development environment, and do an automated check, which is actually very nice. And I can kind of, hopefully this demo won't cut short for that one. So let's see, I have Xcode running. This is just an app that basically mimics Apple Maps, if anyone's familiar with that. So what you would do is you would launch the application, you would build, so that way you can see your app in like a simulator environment. So while we're letting that build, go ahead and start working on the next part. And so while you're still in Xcode, you're going to open up the developer tools, go to Accessibility Inspector. You're going to select the simulator that you're using. And I've already actually ran this just to make sure this wasn't going to not work. But if you run it, it basically is going to do the audit for you and break down exactly which areas on your device are not necessarily complying. So for instance, this map doesn't actually have any information. So no one, like if someone was using a screen reader, they wouldn't know exactly what they're looking at. This UI button, it doesn't also have description, but there is another one around here around like the target size of some of the elements. They provide suggestions for you as well of how to fix it. So they can suggest how, the height to be a certain amount of pixels, so that way it can be at a better touch target size. So this is actually very useful. And then they also have a nice feature, which is if you hit on like the eyeball icon, they already have like a screenshot for you that you can then add notes to as well if you want to like send this to the dev team. Prior to like seeing things like this, Tao and I used to have to go through and like basically add these bounding areas around everything that wasn't accessible on our applications and create these like very elaborate documentations. So as you start to see now, apps are starting to have these automated checks. They really do make it a lot easier for you. All right, let's close out of that. Another one in the mobile world is if you have an Android phone, you can download the accessibility scanner. And this is actually, I think, my most favorite of the automated checks. And it's nice because you can run any app, and with the scanner, it basically will go through, it's this bottom kind of image here, but with the scanner, it'll go through and do that same exact thing that I showed you, like in Xcode and what you would have saw with the AXE example with that plugin. But they also do provide pretty elaborate, I think, suggestions for how you solve the problems. But it's just nice to kind of have it lightweight and in your hand. And you can do this pretty much on any app, which is also really nice too. So you can just get kind of caught up playing around with that app. And there's several more. These are ones just to take note for you guys if you end up wanting to kind of play around and see exactly, how that feels to do the test. And because of that, there really isn't there really isn't like, one size fits all. It's really one size doesn't fit all. It doesn't always fit all. And really, it's just around choosing the best tool for you. Because, you could be an expert at one particular tool, but you might not really understand what the output is. And really, this is around trying to become compliant and implementing these changes. So if you can't explain that to like your dev team, for instance, or communicate that to people within your organization, it's probably not the best tool for you. A lot of times, like I said, the Wave tool, we were using that for a long time and realized that the output wasn't really useful for our needs. And so, make sure that you're choosing tools that are best for your group. All right, let's dive into the keyboard test. So these are kind of like the basic keyboard elements or components that you would use for navigation for web and desktop. So tabbing, I was saying something about tabbing through the navigational structure of your site. That's one that you can do today. If you go up to a computer and you start tabbing, you can do that pretty much on anything, desktop, web, and then mobile is a little bit different, but I'll get into that a little later. Shift plus tab is basically going back into that navigational structure. So once you go in, you can go out. And that's really just moving the keyboard focus. And then enter is really around just entering if you want to select something, if you want to click on a link, you're tapping enter. Enter space is also another way of selecting things. You'll typically see this too if you're selecting something like in a drop-down box or a checkbox or a radio button. And then you're always using your arrow keys for the most part to navigate between menus, forms, drop-down boxes as well. These are kind of like the standard. So if you go in like Google, Windows, Microsoft Windows, keyboard, keyboard accessibility, or you look at like Apple keyboard accessibility, you're gonna kind of see the overlap of basically what we're showing here today of the primary things if you wanted to get started today. And then there's a whole bunch of other workflows of other keyboard commands that each of those have. And so it is to take note that you should be checking these things and also documenting them. So if you are promoting that your company, that your org is doing accessibility checks, I would also try to provide shortcuts, these keyboard shortcuts, and say that you also have this ready to go and that people can use that as a reference when navigating through your apps. So I would always still try to provide those keyboard shortcuts or commands. And the expected outcome of doing keyboard navigation or when you're doing the testing is that you interact with all the controls, the links, the menus, only using the keyboard. So no mouse clicks at all whatsoever. See what item has focus at all times. So you should be able to, when you're tabbing or you're shift tabbing or you're using the arrow keys, you should be able to see what am I actually selecting or what's highlighted. Typically you'll see like a blue bounding area or a bounding box around the thing that's selected, or I know like on sometimes on like Google, you might see like this like little like dark gray kind of like line that kind of shows up. So between that, you should see some type of indication that highlights that you are selecting on that particular element in the page. You do not want to have a keyboard trap. I can't explain that enough. If you are doing testing, you'll probably find the frustrations. I know one that's always happened before is like you get into a dialog box, you've opened up like a modal dialog, and then you can't get out of that dialog. Which seems like it would be very easy, but if you don't have things structured the correct way, there's sometimes you get locked in and now you have to kind of cheat and, of course, click outside of the dialog to start all over again. So keyboard trap is one that you also want to try to avoid and check for and make sure that at least at the minimum, even if you were saying people who are sighted users that don't have that many disabilities, but they just want to have keyboard shortcuts, keyboard trap in a dialogue, I can tell you now, is probably the most frustrating because people like to kind of typically use shortcuts for things like that, closing and opening. Off-screen content, so responsive navigation, if your page is being responsive, you don't want to be receiving focus on places that you can't see, especially if they are invisible. So once again, we talked about like if you're in a header and you're tabbing, you want to have that expected order of operations. And if something is not of expectation, one, one is you don't know where it is on the page, but if you don't know where it is, also now you're going back to that 2.1.2, which is around the keyboard trap, which is like you don't even know where you're at, you can't get out, and how do you even get back to where you're at? So you definitely want to make sure that you're taking those things into account too when you're looking at responsive design. And so we can kind of give you guys an example of that. I'm actually going to jump to so I'll do this one really quickly, but I'm going to jump to the other example too that talks about the focus order and customizing that focus order. So some companies, and we promote this to kind of like customize the focus order so that it uses CSS. And that basically makes that blue bounding area a little thicker and more noticeable. So that's something that you kind of extra treatment that you have to put on the already like default state of that. But I'm going to go ahead and just tabbing through, and actually let me turn on, if you're interested in this app, Tal actually showed me this app. It's called Keycaster. And now you guys can see what I'm doing as well when I'm presenting. So hopefully I don't get stuck into Keycaster while I'm doing this stuff. Okay, here we go. So I'm just hitting the tab button, going into things. All of my components are accessible at this point. I should be able to get to the zoom. Keycaster is really doing interesting. I just hit enter. Let's see if I can get to the map. Tabbing now to minimize this map, and then I'm going to go back to home. I can also change the view of this back into satellite view. Switch back. So this is pretty accessible, but what's one thing you guys notice with this map? I'm going to turn off Keycaster so it doesn't interrupt my flow. What's one thing that someone notices about my tabbing order? I'll do it again. So let's just say this is the beginning. Anybody? Okay. So that's all around the tab index. So this is all around the indexing of my elements. So one thing that we can do, let's just go in, it's always going to this guy here. So let's just go in and see what is going on. I'm gonna change the view of, no, I don't wanna change the view of that. So it has a tab index of 3. And so if I actually wanted to make it hit that, the accessibility icon or the wheelchair icon, one thing that I can do is go in and actually specify the tab index to be, which one is it? I don't actually see this guy. Where is he at? There he is. All right, sweet. Let's just grab this so I can copy and paste and make it easier on myself. Let's make it a tab index of 1, and let's see what happens here. Should work. Let's start from the beginning. Hey, there we go. So tab index order is really huge and important. This is an easy check that even if you aren't a developer, you can go through the code and actually check, you know, as you're going through, you can kind of highlight that, and then that's an easy fix for your devs or even for you to go in and fix. But this is something that really does help. We talked about the expectation of the navigational structure order of using the page, and so that is huge, that you make sure that you can hit all these points in like a familiar or traditional sense for the user. All right, let's go back into the presentation. So enhanced focus, this is another example, but this is showing you guys like kind of with the custom CSS, the difference between that. So this first example is actually using the custom CSS to highlight around the elements on the page. I'm going to use space to check this checkbox. And I'm tabbing, using space again, tabbing to the drop down. This is typically like a default outline look. And so it's not bad. It's not that you need to change them, but we do prefer to use like a custom if you can, if you get a chance. And it just makes it more easy for the users who have visual impairments to be able to see things that are of focus. Now, I can tap to this one. It's still fine. But when you get over to this next guy, you can't see anything because basically there is no outline until you get into this input box. And you'll find that as you do a check and you go on websites or you go into other applications that are desktop applications, you'll find that this sometimes is the case if they're not really using kind of like the native components, native buttons, and they're kind of doing custom stuff. A lot of times you'll miss that basically that outline that is an indicator that you are on an element in the page. All right, so screen reader testing. So the recommended combinations that we have for this, so for instance, if you do have a Mac, you would use VoiceOver, which is already baked in. For Windows, you have two options, NVDA or JAWS. I believe at Esri, we actually, because NVDA is free, so of course we were started using that, and then we put in a request for JAWS, and I believe we have it now, but I actually am not as familiar using JAWS as NVDA. And then you can also apply a lot of this on your browsers, so Safari for Mac, Firefox for Windows, and IE Edge. And so some of the commands to get started, Command plus F5, and you guys can just kind of take a look at this list. I don't have to necessarily read it, but there's kind of some commands to kind of get started. You also can Google this as well if you need help. And I believe if you go actually into your actual settings of your OS, you'll be able to tap on accessibility, click on it, and actually get it ramped up that way as well within like your general settings. So WAI ARIA authoring practices is kind of, I think they work hand in hand when you're thinking about doing a screen reader test. And really the key thing around this is making sure that the elements, the components within your page actually have specified roles. And so you kind of have to keep that, like they say something, I guess, in the guidelines around like keeping your promise when you actually state the role of that component. And so if you're using a button, make sure it behaves like a button and make sure that you're using all the baked in things that come with a native button. And if you're not using a button, do not have something behaving like that, which is if I hover over it. And so it really is just staying true to the components and elements on your page and specifying those roles. A lot of times we'll see if you're using like custom components, so like say, I know at one point we were really using custom buttons, and you lose a lot of the expected behavior that you would get when you're doing, like, for instance, a keyboard navigation. You don't get, for instance, the selection of the button or the hover state that would look like the hover state if I used my mouse. And when I select the button, though it might select, there might be some other weird issues with it. So you lose a lot of the baked-in things when you're not really specifying those roles and really treating those components as like the native components or expected behavior of those components. We'll also see that with like drop-down boxes. And you'll see that a lot, or if you have like some custom type of check boxes. So a lot of times, like for instance, legends, we work for mapping companies. So a lot of time the legend, when you're turning things on, toggles, a lot of times you'll see people kind of playing around with that in like a custom sense, but it really makes your life easier. And so there's quite a few references to this on w3.org that you can reference, and they do give you some good examples of it. But basically, this is the basis for doing or having a successful screen reading test. And key things to think about when you are doing a test on the screen reader. So there's really three main areas: navigation, content, and then the interaction itself. And I'm going to go through, actually I'm going to jump out and I can just, do I want to do that way? I think I will. Let's see if I can. Sometimes this demo doesn't. Let's just go to WebAIM. Now you guys know how to get there. If it wants to go. Oh, the internet. Okay. That's why I have this demo here. We'll just jump back. So there's a couple things when you do a screen reader test. I'm using Mac on this, but if you were on your Windows, you could definitely do that with NVDA or JAWS. The first one, let me jump to this example first, is that once you jump into the screen reader, you can actually get your help of how to navigate through it. So don't feel like, oh, if I don't know how to use the screen reader, I'm not gonna be able to kind of know the commands. So I showed you like those primary commands, but you definitely can still get into knowing which commands, and it will talk you through. I have this audio turned off just so that way I can actually talk over this thing, because I've tried to do it while this is going, and it's hard for people to hear both me and what's going on with the screen reader. The other example is, so we have like this list, for instance, of navigation content interaction. How I can actually test for that is using what they call a rotor, and it's really like the navigational menu for you if you're using a screen reader. For VoiceOver, I believe it's like Control Option U. And it's really, they say it's actually VO, and so how they have it documented, like you'll see behind the screen here, they have that document as VO, but it's really Control Option is what they're referencing. But how I can get to checking headings and links and landmarks, which landmarks are actually the main, like the groupings of my layout on the page. So maybe I have like the top banner, and then I have like a side menu, and then I have like the body of the page, of the web page, or if it was a mobile app, I could have like, for instance, my nav bar with all my tools in it, and then I have like my map might be a landmark, and then I have like a panel that has content that I can search for things. So really, if you use those commands, you can kind of get in and use that rotor menu as a way to navigate to all of these different things to check. So whether it be alt text, tables, charts, forms, dialogues, and get right into them. So it's like kind of like what I like to say, like the accessibility cheat sheet of navigating through. But you want to make sure that you can use that, because it makes life a lot easier and cuts down the time when you're going through. It kind of gives you some organization as to like, what am I looking at? Because if I were to pop that that rotor up and click on, I think it shows up here, yeah. If I pop the rotor up, and I'm gonna skip links, but let's say that it actually said headings, or headings is a good example. It'll go through the entire page listing out, once I click on headings, it'll go through the entire page listing out all the headings that are in this page that are listed as a H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. And so the same thing with the links. As soon as I start clicking on all these links, these are the things that the screen reader is picking up that are links in this particular page. So it really does make, if you're doing testing, this kind of gives you some organization to it. Otherwise, you're gonna find yourself doing like what we did in the beginning at Esri, tabbing through everything and then turning on the screen reader and not knowing what to do because it was just chaos. So this is definitely the best way to do it if you're going to use a screen reader to try to test through, for instance, a website or a desktop app. Let's see, get it. There we go. So here's for VoiceOver for folks that were interested in Mac. I just kind of wanted to repeat that again. If you are using it or you're interested in using VoiceOver, and it would typically be like an alternative to that for NVDA, but it's around it's the same kind of concept as far as the commands go. I forget what they call it. It's not BO. And then on mobile, so it kind of translates over nicely. So on mobile, you have a couple different things for those who are interested. You do have to think about gestures. So gestures are going to be whether you tap with 2 fingers, if you double tap, if you triple tap. So I definitely would, they have a few different cheat sheets for that to help you get through if you're interested in testing. And then I also would provide those once again to your users so they know how to utilize those type of gestures within using your application. This is actually, you guys can get a sneak peek of Navigator. It's still in develop, but I can share some of it with you guys. If you want to access that, you would go to the accessibility options in your settings, turn on VoiceOver, and then basically after that, you are in accessibility mode. You would be able to double tap on actions to kind of get out. And then from there, it's basically this entire list of what you can and can't do. I'll let it get to Navigator so you guys can see. We didn't do too bad, actually, when I did this test. It's very blurry, but One thing to note on navigating with a mobile app, though, is the touch targets actually it becomes a reality for you as you're trying to do this without being able to not be in accessibility mode. And one thing to know about accessibility testing for mobile is you still have to interact with the device. People who have visual impairments, they can use Siri. I've seen someone actually navigate their entire experience on their phone using Siri. But for those who have like low vision or they just want to test out this accessibility, typically you are going to interact still with the application. So those touch targets is like really the bread and butter of an experience on phone. All right. And then color contrast is my next guy. Okay. So the expected outcomes is just not to use presentation for color contrast. I don't know why it's, yeah, skip that. For color contrast, the expected outcomes is not to rely solely on color. So, and I think people I think in the industry, at least on the design side, people have moved away from that. But you used to see like back in the day, you know, if something was wrong or there was an error, you just put up something red, you know, and if something was good, you put up something green, you know, and then maybe if something was kind of so-so, you just put up something yellow and people are supposed to get it. And then people start getting crazy with colors. But the problem is really around just the fact that one is there's a lot of people who are colorblind. My husband actually is, and so he's a great test subject. He always has to give me a test and check. And so you really want to make sure that you're accounting for those individuals, but then also there's this thing about the color contrast. So for someone who is also colorblind or who has like low vision impairments, having this ratio be at least 4.5 to 1 or 3:1 for large text is very key. And actually my husband was just telling me the other day he was looking at something and it just gave him a headache because he couldn't understand. He has like the red, I think it's like red-green color blindness or something like that. So it was like red background with some type of like blue or green text, and I'm like, what site were you looking at? Who's doing that? But basically, he was just like, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't read it. Like it was stressing me out. So this is definitely something that you want to check for. How you can get this test check, how you can do this this check is through several different tools. We provided 2 here, and if you guys are familiar, so WebAIM I'm promoting because this is kind of like the start if you're new to accessibility checking. WebAIM, you go there, they have like all kind of resources for all different types of things related to accessibility. But if you go there, they actually have a contrast checker. In that contrast checker, they actually explain to you the explanation of why this passes or fails. And once again, they've listed the AA, AAA to make sure that you are counting for those. You know, you want to make sure, like I said, if you can in the AA ballpark, you're good to go. So they do have a really good contrast checker that you can take a look at. And then the other one is the contrast ratio calculator. And so this one is also kind of nice because you can kind of write out what the color is. So if I type in purple, let's see. It'll change for me dynamically, so it is kind of nice. I can also use like percentages, for instance, and I can swap these easily. So this is a little bit more of an update. There is another one called, I believe it's like color.io or something like that, but basically it gives you, if you're interested in trying to come up with like a color palette that's accessible, they can give you a range of colors based off of like where your criteria is. So say like I want to use black text on like some type of background, they'll give me a color palette that will work for that's accessible. So there's a couple different tools that you guys can use. We can give an example of just kind of how you put that in. We can take a look at Esri.com, which has had a lot of work done recently. Looks like they're using this particular color on a white background. So we'll type that in. We'll just go ahead and use WebAIM for this. So the foreground is going to be the text. The background, of course, is going to be the background. For this particular one, they do fail for the AAA, but they do pass on AA, on normal and large text. And that's, you know, when I talk about aiming to be compliant, this is kind of around that ballpark, which is it's okay if you're failing in some areas. The main thing is you're aiming to compliant. And this is actually a really good result. I've seen some where it's like fail, and maybe pass for one of those options. So that's kind of an example of how you can go through and use the color contrast tool. And we're getting actually to the end of this, but in summary, you want to start with automated tests. And then you want to go ahead and do the keyboard test, screen reader, and then color contrast can happen at any point. You do need to understand the guidelines and the success criteria, so I do advise that you still take a look. You can also, though, go to WebAIM. You don't have to necessarily go to WCAG 2.0. You can go to WebAIM, and they should be able to also give you some examples, and I think it actually is a little more user-friendly on some of the content that they provide and the examples. And then they have quite a bit of tools like the WebAIM, like the color contrast checker that I just showed you guys. Get familiar with the ARIA labeling or the ARIA for widgets. That is going to be very helpful if you aren't non-developer and you're trying to talk to a developer about implementing those changes that you found. And the reason for that, like I said before in the presentation, is that is really that semantic structure that's in the code, that labeling, those roles really are the bread and butter for how the screen reader will be able to understand exactly what's happening on the screen. And then I added this last piece, which kind of speaks to even some of the ARIA labeling, which is using native accessible components, whether it be mobile, whether it be desktop, whether it be web. There's some basic structures of just how, buttons are buttons. Use the basic button. Don't try to customize and make a fancy button because it's already baked in. It has the accessibility stuff already baked in, so there's no need in you trying to reinvent the wheel. We found ourselves a lot, like when I worked on Insights, we used a whole bunch of custom stuff. And when I did the accessibility check, which I will not show, it was pretty gnarly. The development team, we had to go back and clean some things up. Some of the semantic structure of even the code had to get cleaned up, all because we were doing too much custom stuff. And though things look great, and on the big stage it had sparkles, there was a lot of weird bugginess. And so, if you really want to comply, and you also just want to have a great user interface, that's a great user experience, I would say really try to use those native components that are already accessible and baked in. So with that being said, the ultimate decision maker about whether or not something is accessible is whether or not people can use it. So if you ever question yourself on, is this compliant? Am I meeting, the rules and regulations? It really just comes down, can I use it? Am I stuck? Am I in a keyboard trap? Can I not get out? That's really going to be the thing that is kind of like your signifier for if you need to jot this down as a problem or if you guys can overlook it and just move past it. And so if you guys want to learn more about accessibility, this gentleman sitting right in the front, Tal, he is going to be able to kind of do a deeper dive. So I showed you that parks locator map. He's going to show you a little bit more about how to fix that map up to make it even more accessible. Him and Kelly are going to walk through and kind of do a deeper dive. So they have a session on that, and then they also still have a session on like just a broader overview of 508 and WCAG as well. So if you guys are interested in some more accessibility learning, please do check them out tomorrow. One session at 9, the other at 2:30. And then if there's anybody that thinks of themselves slightly as a designer or just a UX researcher or just a person who loves to make things work well, and you're more interested in the types of testing that we're doing at Esri, I would say to come to the usability testing session as well. I have a good colleague, Brian, and also another good colleague, Kyle, who are kind of our UX researchers who will be walking through kind of the usability testing that we do at Esri. And their session is tomorrow as well at 9. So I think if we can just get half of the room to go to Brian and Kyle's and then half the room to go to Tal and Kelly's, I think we'll be in a good place. But yeah, do-it-yourself usability testing is key. I'm not sure if they're going to they might talk a little bit about accessibility there, but I think they're going to not try to share the floor too much with Tal and them since they're going to be covering that tomorrow as well. So if you guys can, please take our survey. All you have to do is just download the Esri Events app, select the session you attended, scroll down to find the feedback section, give me all those stars and give me all those 5s, and then go ahead and just hit submit, and then we're good to go. All right? So with that, if you guys have any questions, if you want to show us some stuff that we could take a look at, maybe we have a solution for how you can go about it. Some things can get a little bit technical, especially if you are using like GIS applications, so we understand. Maybe we've had a solution before and prior. I have Tal here too as well to answer any questions. So the floor is open. If not, please have a great evening. And tomorrow, if you're staying for the party hard. All right? Thank you guys. I was Whitney. Nice to meet you guys. Thanks. Any questions? All right. Tao, can you, we have 2 mics. Okay.
What's Esri's goal for standards? Okay, all right, sounds good. What's Esri's goal for standards? Is it AA? Is it AAA? What's your personal goal?
So typically, at least I know, at least on the products that I've supported, and I can, Tao, you can kind of speak to it too, is I understand that we are trying to reach AA if we can. That's like the nice place in the middle. John, would you attest to that too as well? Yeah. So AA, and like I said before earlier in the presentation, that gives us a mixture of aiming to be compliant. We know we're working with some complex workflows, some of the stuff that you can do, for instance, like in ArcGIS Pro, with some of our layout tools, like not everything is going to be accessible, but we're aiming. But we can also still make sure that the UI, the UX still looks pretty good too as well. So AA is kind of keeping you somewhere nice in the middle.
Okay, so then I do have a follow-up question.
Okay.
We're working with ArcGIS, both 3.x and 4.x. We've noticed that in 4.x there have been huge improvements. A lot of things we don't have to do anymore that we previously had to do. But for those older applications we have that are legacy, that are 3.x, is Esri still pushing out ADA help, or are we still on our own?
So I'm not going to lie. There was an effort when we first started, and I'm going to say like even 3 years ago, that we were trying to go back to some of the legacy apps, like even ArcMap itself. We were trying to make sure that we could try to make things compliant. I remember ArcScene, we were trying to kind of go in and bake in some things, but the priority hasn't been as emphasized. So I would say it's still on the roster of things that we want to get to, but it's not necessarily the priority because we had ArcGIS Online, we had our field operation apps all happening at the same time. So I would say it's not we're not going to try to do it. It's just maybe not as the highest priority right now.
And then do you have a chart of things, for example, for ArcGIS, JavaScript API by chance or something, where you're saying what is accessible, what's not at which standard levels? Like something that's saying like a particular feature that is AA or AAA.
I know we communicate from like a legality. We do communicate about where we're at on accessibility for each of the products. So we can point you there, but as far as like on our API portion of it, I'm not sure exactly if John, do you have an answer for that one?
We haven't posted it yet. We've just finished auditing the runtime, the 100.x runtime SDK, so that's our focus.
Okay.
So we just finished doing an audit of, we have independent outside auditors as well that come in and audit and do the VPATs. And so we just finished runtime, the runtime SDK. I know that Web App Builder is going through a major upgrade, so the March release of Web App Builder is going to significantly close a lot of accessibility issues.
And then
So-
Calcite Web as well has done quite a bit of work. So if anyone that's tapping into that framework, if you're trying to build out any web, using web components of ours, you basically will be able to get those for free. And color contrast was also something that was accounted for in those checks.
Okay.
Do you know about our VPAT site?
What was that?
Do you know about our VPAT site? So,
No, I do not.
Trying to think how we can. So on our
can pull it up.
contracts
Ty, you wanna
page, we
pull
have a
that up
site
for
where
me?
we list all our VPATs, and they go way back through
Let's see.
1.0 templates up to the current ones.
Okay.
And so,
Right. The reason I'm asking, we have to provide AAA in the state of Michigan, or at least we're trying to.
okay.
So that's our goal. And our biggest focus, or our biggest problem with Esri and writing mapping applications is that we don't really know how far Esri is helping us with ADA and how much we have to code ourselves just to be AAA compliant.
Well, Section 508, which U.S. standard is, and they incorporated last year WCAG, and it's
Okay.
WCAG 20A and AA, right? So that's what we test to.
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah, so here's our page. We've got
Okay.
some more going up tomorrow. We just got, so.
Where's the API one?
Let me snap a picture.
Yes, if you guys go to Esri.com, you can actually just type in Esri VPAT and it should show up. But if you go to Esri.com and within that page, if you go to accessibility and then the legal tab for that, you'll be able to get to our voluntary product accessibility templates. And we should be updating these, is it yearly?
We've got 3 more going up. Just got approved to put up today. So we've got Pro, Enterprise, and Online with Insights that are going up. So those will be available next week.
Just so you guys can kind of see what all goes into it. So typically we do like to try to like sync this up to not only WCAG, but making sure that it still speaks to, for instance, if there's any Section 508 mentionings, because we still have to use that as the global basis for our company. So we kind of go through and explain it. You'll see in this section whether it supports or doesn't support. There used to be a time, I'm not gonna lie, when we used to see this deck and it would say, no, wait, we had a phrase that we would use. It wasn't not support, but it was like a very eloquent way of saying that it isn't. But we started to look, and all of us were looking, and we're like, none of these are supported, you know? And it was like an eloquent, legal team told us to say it this way, but I'm so glad now, especially with the help of like Tao and John, like this is the ArcGIS Online one, that we can actually say, yeah, not applicable is now what we're saying. But it was just funny because when we first used to look at this, it used to be pretty bad. So we're doing much better with this.
I mean, the one issue we have is because it is a management application, we really don't have a way for somebody's totally blind, right? There's a lot of research going on in that area, but if you're totally blind, they have that, right, partially blind.
Right, and we're not so much worried about the map itself. Like a lot of times, the map we consider as a third party, and it'll become an exception. Simply because if you have 100,000 features on the map, there's no way you're going to tab through those.
Yeah.
But so for us, it's more like the widgets that are being used on maps.
Zooming,
search
zooming
tools.
out,
Anything
legend.
that's on the map additionally, other than like our left side legend menus or anything like that, which with 4.x, they're already much more improved than anything 3x ever did. But yeah, the concern for us is always like, how much support are we getting?
Right.
And how much can we look for in the future?
Well, we have an alias that you can actually, it's just section 508 at esri.com, and you can post, we're all on it. We look
Okay.
And that crew that I talked about of people, all of us are tapped into it. So basically you'll get an email from one of us giving you an answer to fix it, or to let you know where we're at with that, if it's something that you can't fix on your end, but that we're actively working on.
Okay. Can I get that in?
Yeah. You wanna, can you type that out for me?
That'd be awesome.
You do test, you know, and.
I might have it in my email actually, but maybe not go through my
You
email.
have someone outside who's testing for you, and they find results, just please send them to us, and we'll
Yeah.
definitely do it through.
Yeah, well, I don't do the testing. I'm a developer, but
Yeah,
I'm the
but,
one
you
that
know.
deals with the aftermath.
Oh yeah.
We have people say, you know, organizations say, we just had the outside auditor go through and test for us, and this is what they found, and we all like to get it and see. how-
We had another question, I think, in the back there.
Yeah.
As we make a lot of mapping applications, I have a lot of questions about the map itself. Like if you go back to, and you don't have to go back, one of your slides lists a spec for not using, under color, it was for not using color as a sole means of differentiating items on a page.
Yep.
But in a map, it's very commonly used. So what materials or what advice can Esri offer to build maps that try to comply with these WCAG specifications that traditionally use color a lot to differentiate areas or features?
So one of the things is though we're using colors, it's still connected to data, right? And that data is actually, what we're hoping for is that data can still be picked up. And that's going to be the bigger primary thing. When you're working with like a small amount of points, it's actually really easy to probably navigate within the map and be able to basically navigate to each of those points. Yes, when you're working with, you know, over 100,000 points on a map, maybe then that makes it a little more complicated. But it really is about being able to access that legend to understand exactly what that representation, that visual representation actually is, whether it's, you know, a heat map and it's explaining, you know, these particular ranges of information on the map. So I think it's getting access to the legend, getting access to those elements. And then me and Tao have been talking about this too, when you're dealing with a lot of points on a map, having access to the actual data itself would be very useful for users. How you get to that though now is the next question that we're trying to figure out of like, how do you access the data table? You know, how do you access the data table so that way people who are using the screen reader can get away from that. And then to the second point that I wanted to make is that you're always aiming to be compliant. So we're a mapping company, we're using data visualization, color, like you said, is in the forefront. It is kind of the primary thing. But that's okay. I think really what it comes down to, like that quote that we left with, is like, as long as people can access the information, that's all we're trying to do. Yes, you might have to use color if you don't have any impairments to be able to understand what's happening on the map, but I still should be able an alternative way to understand what that data, how that data is being represented. And so maybe there's other ways that you can kind of bake in to kind of give users with impairments or visual impairments access to that data in a different light, in an alternative way. Tao, have you guys, Kelly and you, have you guys played around with other alternatives for when you're dealing with, for instance, like, a heat map or some type of crazy?
And there's lots of design tools that you can use. In addition to color, you can use texture, right? You can add text label next to the map. Sometimes it's just alternating the design a little bit and make sure that you have a little bit more information in addition to the color for the user.
So that'd be like a tooltip as you're navigating within the map. Yeah. And that would give you that extra text that you would need to understand what that point is.
I think you have a question?
Oh, no, that was basically.
Oh, okay.
We have a really similar issue with, like, if you have a lot of layers, for example, where your legends basically start color lapping. So, like, you have the legend from one map service to another map service, and they're both using red. If you turn both layers on, you have an instant problem, right? So you're not going to be color contrasting. And we really haven't found a good solution for that either. It's just something that you're at mercy of, what your legends are.
Yeah.
Because you cannot have, 20 different map services all perfectly color contrasting. It just does not work. I don't know if that's the same issue you're having, the color contrast.
Well, no, that seems more like just a.
So with the color contrast, you guys got to remember too, it's the text up against that background color. So if I have color up against color, though that can also probably, raise some problems for someone with like color blindness, it's really just trying to get that valuable information against that. So if you just have like points, for instance, and there's no labeling next to it, or if you do have labeling, maybe like a pop-up, that's where now, I know like with ArcGIS Online, the use of being able to navigate within pop-ups is very valuable now, because now that is giving you that data and extracting it in a textual format for someone that they can then navigate within. So it kind of takes the context out of the map, because of course that's the more visual representation and putting it more back into the data, the metadata.
That's the other thing, putting data points.
Yeah, and pop-ups is, I would say for me, my answer would be if you're working with a lot of points on a map and you're trying to make them accessible, really look into, figuring out ways to navigate within those pop-ups, accessing the data and being able to have the screen reader pick that information up. To Tao's point, tooltips as well will be great too, to be able to navigate within the map that way to understand what's going on. But thank you guys so much.